Hello students, welcome back to Shore Observes class. So, do you know what I am going to teach you today? It's a very important topic from geology and also a very important phenomenon of Earth. We all live in Earth, we all walk around this planet, but do you ask yourself, why are you reading this subject? To know what is going inside and outside this planet. What are the processes going on? How the soil is forming, how this mountain is building, how oceans are forming. So, today we are going to talk about weathering. All of you have heard of this term, weathering, and erosion as well. So, do you know what does it mean? Okay, I'm going to tell you. Weathering is the process where the Earth's crust forming material like the rocks starts to disintegrating, decomposing, and it changes its nature. It starts breaking off, starts wearing off from the crust. This is the phenomenon of weathering. Various physical, chemical and biological factors helps in the process of weathering. Then what is erosion? Erosion is the process where the weathered material, that is the resultant material like the particles from the rocks or the dusts or the sheets or the breakage falls from where the particles of the rocks comes like a loads, that starts to move from the sides where the weathering process had originated. So, do you understand what is the difference? Weathering is in situ. It means the process starts off at a place and the resultant materials also stays at the place, at the same place. Like the materials don't move away from the place that it has been originated. It stays with the mother rock. And what is erosion? Erosion is the process where this particle starts to move away from the place. The various physical factors like wind, water flow and storm, this helps in moving away of the particle. This is the process of erosion. So this weathering always erosion always involves weathering, but weathering doesn't always involves erosion. Weathering can occur individually. And what are the factors that controls this phenomenon of weathering? It's wind, temperature, like water flow, reaction with water, reaction with atmospheric oxygen, carbon dioxide, various things. There are temperature difference in the day and the night, that is called the diurnal variation of temperature. It also involves the process of weathering. This is the result. So, this physical factors reacts with the rocks and the rock starts to disintegrate, like cracks formed, they starts to wear from the mother body and dust particles forms. It reacts with several chemicals and thus soil is formed as a result. The dust or the loose particles that forms after weathering from a rock named as regolith. And after this regolith starts to disintegrate more and forms like a dust or loose very small particles, they starts to accumulate in a space and in a result of several years of overlying pressure and temperature, it forms a bedrock. So we now came to know how one rock gets weathered, eroded and deposited in a place and then forms soil and bedrock. Other bedrock, the composition can be same or the composition can be different. We are coming to the next step now. There are three types of weathering. One is the physical weathering, second is the chemical weathering, third is the biological weathering. There are several features that controls this processes of weathering. So let's start with the factors that controls the process of weathering, like the structure of the rock, like the texture, the mineral compositions, because the mineral composition is very important, uh, which results in different types of weathering because of various minerals presence in the rock. Like the climate, it controls the wind, it controls the precipitations like the rain or the snowfall or the hails, that obviously helps in the process of weathering. The temperature, wind speed, humidity, moisture content, everything is very important that controls the process of weathering. So climate is the second factor. The third factor is vegetation. Vegetation is the acts like a soil cover or top layer cover of the exposed rock. Uh, in the presence of vegetation, there will be a different type of weathering. In the absence of vegetation, the rocks will be more exposed to the harsh conditions of the weather and the atmosphere. So it will be a different type of weathering. And then the fourth factor is topography. The topography also helps in the undulations of the rock surface. So it helps in the exposure, like how much rain will come to the rock, how much temperature will it receive, how much wind will it get. So the topography also helps in the rock exposed to the uh, top surface. If it is undulated, it will be covered. mm, Less temperature will reach the rock surface. Topography also controls the process of weathering. Uh, so next come to the three type of weathering that I have already mentioned, like the physical weathering, chemical weathering and biological weathering. So what is the physical weathering process? In this process, the chemical composition of the rock doesn't change. Always remember, in this process, the rock only gets disintegrated, particles gets loosened from the parent rock, or dusts are formed, sheets are formed, scaling is getting done, but the mineral compositions doesn't change. So in this process, the major factor that controls the physical weathering is temperature and wind also to some extent. Temperature variation occurs in the place like where the daytime is very hot, the night time is very cool, and this temperature difference is known as diurnal variation. And diurnal variation, uh, where this diurnal variation occurs, the rocks are exposed to harsh temperature differences. Like in the daytime, when the rocks are getting enough sunlight, they starts to expand. We all know that heat expands the material, but in the night time, when it starts cooling off and faces a very low temperature, it starts to shrink. So there is a temperature differentiation and variation in this diurnal variation case. In this case, the rock starts to scaling off like an onion. This process is named as exfoliation, and sheets like structure formed, and this sheets like structure gets detached from the parent rock, and then they starts to wear off and forms a loose particles and debris, and then in the process of erosion they starts to move away from the place. And exfoliation also helps to wear off the upper structure of the rock, and the innermost layer of the rock starts to gets exposed to the harsh condition. In this case, various types of cracks are formed, and in case the cracks are formed, the sunlight penetrate in the rock body, so the weathering process gets more clumsy. So temperature is a very important process, and temperature is a very important physical factors that controls the physical weathering. The Second process, like I will tell, is water. If a water gets penetrate in a crack of a rock, and there is a huge temperature fall in the weather, then the water starts to freeze down. The water, we all know that 11 cc of water freezes down and forms a 12 cc of ice. And in case of this, almost 9.05% of volume expands. So when a water penetrates a rock's crack, then it starts to freeze down, and then the uppermost layer of the water starts freezing first, forming ice sheets like this. And when an ice is formed, the crack starts to expand because of the volume expansion of the water. And when the crack is formed, the fault, there is a occurrence of fault and fractures. And when the fractures are formed, the innermost layer of the rock gets exposed to the harsh temperature, and when the cracks are formed, the rocks gets disintegrated from its body. So this is the second phenomenon of physical weathering. And many times different soluble minerals come and gets deposited in the cracks, and they forms crystal. As more and more solution gets inside the crack, they starts to form crystals, and when the crystal grows like the water, the volume gets expand, cracks are formed, there are formation of fractures, and the rock starts to disintegrate. And also mineral texture also controls the weathering, and like there are different mineral, they react differently to the temperature changes. Like the quartz is a very stable mineral, but other minerals, they starts to decay very easily when the temperature gets changed. So this is called the differential expansion. So when a rock is composed of several minerals, they act differently to the temperature changes. When the temperature gets heated up, the mineral starts to expand in a different manner, and when the temperature falls down, they started to shrink again in a different manner. This involves a change of entropy in the rock, and the rock starts to disintegrate because the particles is moving inside it, the minerals, the entropy, that is the movement of the particles inside a matter, that gets changed. So the second is the wind speed. We all know that there is a famous geological structure known as the mushroom structure, whereas a sand dune like structure, this wind mainly causes physical weathering in arid regions like in the desert areas, where the wind speed has corrosive materials like the sand particles, and a structure get eroded when a wind is heavily moved beside them, and the mushroom like structure is formed. So wind erosion forms a mushroom shaped rock known as pedestral rock. So the next process of weathering is the chemical weathering process. The chemical weathering essentially involves the mineral alteration and the chemical alteration of a parent rock. Otherwise, without the alteration, there is no chemical weathering. Chemical weathering essentially involves chemical and mineralogical alteration of rock. Remember that. And the factors that involves in chemical weathering is oxygen, water, hydration, not hydrolysis, I will tell you in later, and various solutions, carbon dioxide, etc. The oxidation process is the combination of oxygen with other metallic elements. Like the oxygen has particularly affinity towards iron and ferrous or ferric materials. And we all know that the formation of rust, like the similar as the iron deposit starts to get a brickish red color due to the chemical combination of oxygen with the ferrous elements presented in the rock. And the second process is the reaction with carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide resides in the atmosphere. When the raining starts, the rainwater starts to react with the atmospheric carbon dioxide and forms a very low power acid like the carbonic acid. H2CO3 is the formula. The carbonic acid starts to came down with the rain, and they particularly reacts with the carbonate and bicarbonate materials like the marble, the limestone, the chalks. This phenomenon is known as acid rain. If even the sulfur dioxide also and the nitrogen dioxide also reacts with the rainwater, forming the sulfuric acid and nitric acid, but those cases are very rare in India. But this acid rain devastates the marble and carbonate bicarbonate structures, monuments, etc. And the second one is the reaction with water, like the hydrolysis process. Several elements like several soluble minerals gets soluble in the water, and they reacts with the they starts flowing in a direction and starts reacting with the parent rock, and they disintegrate the rock in a with the change of the chemical composition, the simple chemical reaction. And the second one is the hydration. First and foremost, know the difference between hydration and hydrolysis. Hydrolysis is the chemical composition of water molecule reacts with other mineral and change the chemistry of the mineral. But in hydration, there is only a accumulation of water particles with other materials. They just get solubles and move away from the place of the original weathering starts, like the halides, the aluminium minerals like the gypsum, etc. So in case of chemical weathering, the composition of the rock completely alters and forms a completely new material, which furthermore reacts with other weather and atmospheric factors, and finally the soil is formed. We'll talk about it later in the soil formation chapter. The third and the last process of weathering is the biological weathering. The biological weathering can be of two types: biophysical weathering and biochemical weathering. In the biophysical weathering, only the biological factors disintegrates the rock, doesn't change the chemical composition, same as the physical weathering. And the biochemical weathering, the biological factors changes the chemical composition of the rock, similar as the chemical weathering. In case of biophysical weathering, there are several processes involved, like the burrowing of animals, like the earthworms, the rodents, the rabbits. They starts to burrow and dig a hole in the rock materials in order to live there. By this burrowing process, the rock starts to develop fractures, holes. So by the holes and fractures, the rock starts to disintegrate, and by the process of burrowing, the inside materials of the rock also gets exposed to the harsh conditions of the weather, and other process of weathering occurs. And like the plant roots, they also penetrates the rock, and when the plants grow, their roots gets more stronger, and they exerts a excessive force on the parent rock, and the parent rock starts to wear off. Now comes the biochemical weathering. The biochemical weathering is the process where the biological factor changes the chemical composition of the rock. Like when a bacteria or a fungus live in a rock, they starts to metabolize the silicate elements present in the rock. They starts to decompose the silicate minerals, forming silicon, iron, magnesium, calcium, sodium from the parent rock, and the minerals that disintegrates and form these native elements, they act as a nutrients for the microorganisms. And also when a organism dies, they starts to decay and several microorganisms acts on their body. And when this decomposition occurs, several acidic minerals and acidic solutions are released from the body, which starts to react with the parent rock. And when this reaction occurs, mineralogical composition gets changed and the rocks alters and the weathering occurs. So here is the total sum of the weathering chapter. I will tell you about some different chapter like the erosion or the soil formation, which are related to this chapter later on. Thank you so much. We'll meet you next in the Shore Observes class. Bye bye.